Hello everyone, Mark here, and today we're going to be talking about Steven Seagal, Jesse Enkamp, and that two-part video series that was released at the beginning of the month. I wasn't necessarily planning on doing a video review. Initially what I was hoping to do was to reach out to Mr. Enkamp and discuss privately some of the issues that I found while watching the video. And to be clear, I wasn't necessarily intent on discussing all the issues, but more specifically, particularly one that have to do with the Japanese language and culture, and obviously more specifically, martial culture and martial arts and classical martial arts. I tried to reach out to Mr. Enkamp. If you go to his website, there's a contact form that suggests to use the various social media platforms to reach out first. So I tried to do that. I tried to reach out through YouTube comments. Unfortunately, the way I wrote the comment, I think, triggered a review process. Basically, it went to comment review. So I then decided to try to reach out to Mr. Enkamp through Twitter direct message. I had already interacted on some of his tweets before, so I figured out maybe that would be a way to reach out. I still got no reply. So then I went to the tweet, basically announcing the video release for the first part of the video series. I left a number of comments there to explain some of the concerns and issues that I saw. And then again, reiterating that I thought it would be a good idea that we discuss in private. I then went back to the full contact forum after not receiving any response, and I basically sent a message to say, well, you know, here are all the ways that I reached out, and I still get a reply. So right now, still no response, still no replies, and still no news. And so I figured out, well, you know, maybe the best way to reach out to Mr. Enkamp is through the medium he favors seemingly the most, which is YouTube. And here we are making a video. Obviously, a lot of the content is going to be aimed at a broader audience, and hopefully you're going to find this informative. My goal is not to be negative, it's actually to really try to highlight some of the issues that stem from the video and from some of Mr. Segal's statements, and hopefully you're going to find interest in that. So without further ado, let's get started.
So I would show some of the technique in the movies, but most of the real, what we call uraden.
So right from the get-go, starting the interview, there is a made-up word, as far as I can tell, uraden, which I'm guessing is probably written like this in his mind. Now, there is the concept of ura omote in Japanese, so that's just basically kind of two sides of a coin, you know, the front and the back. There is also the notion of just speaking of omote and ura separately when you're talking about classical martial arts. Generally, omote would be the more public form of a practice, or perhaps a practice with some missing components in it that's still allowed to develop some base foundations and basics, but without necessarily sharing the entirety of the art and all its practicality, or all its mechanics at the very least, to any newcomer, essentially. And then the ura would be then taught later as an extension of the omote form. Now, ura-den would be basically, you know, the transmission of the ura, I guess. I've never heard that term before. I asked a few people from various generations, practitioners who have been practicing in Japan for an extensive period of time, people that are relatively new, different people who have practiced in various locations, and nobody seemed to have any idea, or at least nobody has ever heard that term. Interestingly enough, if you search for the characters I've presented a moment ago on Google, you're mostly going to find a specialized liquor store. It seems that it seems like the name is basically associated with shochu, which is a Japanese alcohol. I really don't know if it might be some regionalism that I'm not aware of. Maybe there's something from there that I don't know, but it seems already a little bit fishy from the get-go. Moving on.
We kept secret, until now.
So here's another thing. Secrets that are suddenly made available to a broader public is kind of a little bit fishy to begin with, right? It's like, oh, I have gathered all this secret knowledge that has been secrets for whatever reason, and now I have elected to basically share it with the broader public on YouTube. It's a little bit strange. It's not without precedent, and arguably there are reasons for preservation where you might want to share some of the stuff a little bit more broadly, but quite honestly, it seems a little bit fishy from the get-go. It's kind of like, mystical voodoo kind of thing. Moving on.
But the difference is we're very careful who we teach this.
Again, if you're careful about who you teach these kind of things, I'm not sure you would be the kind of person who would want to basically go on YouTube and start to explain some of those things. A good portion of the series, actually the bulk of the series, is Mr. Segal teaching techniques. If these things were truly secret, and if these things were only taught to carefully select students, it's not the kind of thing that you would actually want to advertise in any way, shape, or form, I would imagine. Moving on.
Turns out, Sensei Segal had mastered a secret style of jujutsu while...
So, secret style of jujutsu. That's really ambiguous. Now, there are forms of jujutsus in, say, Sogo Bujutsu or combined art traditions that are generally not shown to the public. That's just basically, the tradition and the instructor of that tradition electing to only teach to longtime students certain part of the curriculum, and sometimes that includes some jujutsu. However, and as we're going to see through the video, really all that's being demonstrated is essentially concepts that are really coming from Aikido, essentially. Without an explanation of what form of jujutsu, without, say, naming explicitly the tradition, or explaining perhaps some of its origin, providing additional details, again, that's kind of obfuscating the point being made here. Traditions and secret traditions, like the ninjutsu kind of secret tradition, that's not something that's actually all that frequent. Generally, there are historical traces for those for the various traditions that exist in Japan, and you're going to be able to basically have at least some sort of a look at the tradition. You're at least going to be able to identify it by name. So here again, that's a little bit suspicious if you ask me. Moving on.
Residing in Japan, this is what the samurai warriors used on the battlefield.
Here's what the samurai warrior used on the battlefield. You'll notice that the pictures being shown here already, nobody's wearing armor, so I have a hard time to believe that these are battlefield techniques being demonstrated here. The jujutsu that you would actually have to use when dealing with somebody that's in yoroi, or full armor, would be very different than when dealing with an opponent that's just wearing more casual clothing, like being shown here. That would have been kind of everyday wear, I believe. It's not to say that basically later form of jujutsu weren't inspired by battlefield concept, and battlefield combat notion, but the notion that jujutsu was essentially something that was quite widely used on the battlefield is actually completely wrong. I'll link it to a recent podcast release that you can find on YouTube in the description below. I strongly invite everyone who's watching this video to actually have a look and listen at that podcast entry. There's a very good description, I think, of what you should be expecting when it comes down to the place that jujutsu actually played historically on the battlefield. Generally, when you're talking about jujutsu as well, and classical jujutsu, you would basically have a lot of traditions that actually really started to emerge more mid to end Edo period. So basically we're talking the 1700 and 1800. This was a time of peace in Japan. And as such, there might have been some cross-pollination with weapons tradition that found their route into older times, but the actual practice of jujutsu would have been by that time pretty much detached from the battlefield for all intent and purpose. Now obviously we're talking generalities here, but those distinctions do not come across when you're making broad sweeping statement like this is the kind of stuff that was practiced in the battlefield. It takes a lot more context, and quite frankly, it's not, I think, a productive statement to make when we're talking about practices, which we're going to see in a moment, are probably not from the battlefield anyway. Moving on.
People say all fights end up on the ground, they are incorrect. 90% of the fights that I know end standing up, with one person going horizontal.
So I'd love to see the actual statistics that he's using here. He seems to be hinting at personal experience. Kind of sounds to me like it would be the kind of thing that you might actually expect in a certain context in cage match fighting or sports competitive. But the reality is that, that statistic needs context. Are you talking about, modern battlefield hand-to-hand combat? Are you talking about bar fights? Are you talking about law enforcement altercations involving law enforcement? Context matters greatly when you're talking about hand-to-hand combat, and here there's none of it is being provided. So, yeah, moving on.
They knew if they went to the ground, they were dead because they were on the battlefield. Right. We don't want to dive down on the ground. And just as much time as those guys spend trying to dive for your...
So I'm going to stop here for a moment. You don't want to go to the ground, arguably. But at the same time, if you do end up on the ground simply because, it's a battlefield, I mean, it's muddy and slippery and, you might actually lose your footing and end up on the ground and, just the opponent end up, running you over or whatnot, you're still going to need some notions of ground fighting, arguably, to be able to get back on your feet or at least to create distance and to regain a favorable position. So it's a little bit of a strange argument to make, in my opinion, especially if you're talking about, battlefield combat. You don't want to just dive to the ground, granted, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that this is not a curriculum that wouldn't be of any use. Moving on.
Your legs and get you. Yeah. We spend just as much time cutting your head off or knocking you out or ripping your eyes out or ripping your throat out or severing your brainstem.
Okay, I guess the assumption here is that you're either using a small blade that would have been basically a secondary weapon. There is an allusion to severing a brainstem bare hand later on in that video as well. So I think that might be what is being referred to here in that last portion of the sentence. I think that's a little bit kind of blown out of proportion here in terms of statements. You wouldn't be able to sever somebody's brainstem just like with a hand chop or anything. There are some movements in classical jiu-jitsu that are going to be representing, again, using a secondary weapon. Maybe that's what he's referring to here. But it's kind of bombastic in nature. I mean, not all jiu-jitsu is about just, murdering someone, right? Some of it is, some isn't. And it really depends on the context. So I guess here that's a reference to battlefield practices. But again, if you were in a battlefield, would you really care about severing somebody's brainstem with, your hand? No, you would basically just stab the person with, whatever blade or weapon you have at proximity that actually matches the kind of distance you're dealing with, in terms of distance between you and the opponent. Moving on.
This is amazing. Is this what a Hollywood superstar eats on a daily basis?
This is what Japanese would eat every day. This is what a samurai would eat.
Do I really need to say it? I don't think that's what a samurai would be eating. I'm living in Japan. This is certainly not the kind of thing that, the most Japanese people eat on a daily basis. Now, to be fair, people would frequently eat salmon as part of their breakfast. That's fine, but there's no rice. Anyway, moving on.
As the first Westerner to run a dojo in Japan.
So I'm going to stop right here. I don't know that he was the first Westerner to operate a dojo in Japan, but even if you take that statement for granted, you have to put it in context. He ran his father-in-law's dojo, really. He took over from his father-in-law in the end. So granted, being a foreigner in the 70s, at the head of a dojo, it's no small feat. Again, it has to be put in context. The other thing that you have to keep in mind is that there were, a number of foreigners in Japan prior to Mr. Segal who were in positions of, predominance in the modern martial arts and traditional martial arts community. Terry Dobson was a direct student of Ueshiba Morie Sensei, which you can see on the picture in the background. And that was in the 60s. There's people like Don Draeger who were in Japan during the 60s and 70s and who are considered today to be pioneers of classical martial arts, and at least making classical martial arts accessible to the West and to Westerners. I would argue, speaking about either of those people, depending on what your cup of tea is, would have been probably more instructive to whatever audience you wish to cater to than talking about Mr. Segal and having to sift through what is true, what is not, and what is kind of somewhere in between, and having to go through the trouble of figuring out what the truth is. Moving on.
Sensei Segal faced lots of adversity, including dojo yaburi, life or death challenges from rival martial arts schools.
Okay, so dojo yaburi isn't life or death, duel necessarily. First of all, there's plenty of dojo yaburi that's not even a duel to begin with. Dojo yaburi just means you go to some dojo and you mess with them, right? Either formally or informally. In the 70s, it would not necessarily be wouldn't be uncommon, but it did happen that people would just basically go and register to a dojo, spend a few months there, and then start to mess around with students and with the teacher just to kind of test them. That was a form of dojo yaburi. Nothing about life or death in there. Now, it doesn't mean that there weren't any serious challenges being made every once in a while, and it doesn't mean that there weren't any sense of danger. People would actually get pretty intense in some dojo yaburi. But at the same time, it's not necessarily life or death, and if that's what Mr. Encamp was told by Mr. Segal, then he was misled. I would suggest that Mr. Encamp should do better research before basically doing narration and voiceover, including this type of content. Moving on.
Great real samurai says, when I wake up in the morning, I am prepared to die. When I go into battle, I visualize myself as already being dead.
Okay, so that statement is basically, a butchering of a book called the Hagakure. It was written during the Edo period. It was essentially meant as kind of a manual or educational book for vassals in regards to how they could serve best their lord. The actual quote, which I'll make sure to put here in the translated form below, really hints to the idea that this is something you should meditate upon every day, and not just about like battle, but also about just dying out of terrible sickness, from basically getting caught at sea in a storm and drowning, falling into a volcano, I think is one of the examples included. And ultimately the idea behind this is that it's about readiness. It's about being ready for everything and anything, so to be of best service to your lord in this particular case. And if you want to make a modern interpretation, you could think of it as being of best service and help to others, to your family, friends, to society at large. And here he's kind of really butchering the quote, which unfortunately kind of comes across as extremely bombastic, when I think, or at least I would argue, there's far more wisdom in the original quote.
Really feel the power of Steven Seagal.
This kind of a strike is...
Ooh!
I don't know if you just noticed what Mr. Encamp tried to do here. He actually tried to push the board away from the face of the person who's holding it, because he saw that coming. He saw that, like, when punching through, Mr. Segal would basically just hit his Uke in the face. I just noticed this. This is really interesting. I was intending to actually make a comment on that, but yeah, good job, Mr. Encap. You actually tried to make it safer for the gentleman there, but unfortunately that was to no avail. With that said, I mean, if Mr. Segal is supposed to be such an illustrious instructor, you would assume that he actually would have thought about that. So I'm a little bit confused as to why he didn't elect to, kind of create a distance and actually make the practice safe. There's really no benefits from holding the board that close to your face, either for the trainer or the trainee, for the person holding the board or the trainee. And if there's anything that I know from martial arts, classical or otherwise, is that safety always comes first. Moving on.
This is my fighting pose.
Yeah.
And from...
So this is the thing that bothers me a little bit with the whole battlefield martial arts, that then you move to something that clearly would be only applicable to a peaceful civilian environment. You don't actually have a stance like this on the battlefield at any time. You know, this is something that I found throughout the video that I thought was really confusing. It's like, you know, you have to pick a lane at some point. Either you're talking about classical battlefield or modern battlefield, or you're talking about the streets, or you're talking about self-defense, or you need to actually contextualize the practice you're demonstrating, because otherwise it's more or less meaningless. Moving on.
In the street,
Yeah.
people normally will not punch you like this.
Right.
They normally won't punch you like this. They'll punch you like this. As it comes, you'll notice something very different.
Uh-huh.
This in sword is called Uke Nagashi.
If you're looking for an example of what Uke Nagashi looks like, you can see one right over my shoulder. Uke Nagashi is that movement where you actually take the blade, lift it up, like you saw the gentleman do it here, and basically have the blade land here and basically slide off, right? It's far easier said than done. You have to get the right angle. This here, which what I was showing, is actually a kata named Uke Nagashi. If you look at what Mr. Segal demonstrate, once again,
It comes, you'll notice something.
if you look at that movement, that has nothing to do with Uke Nagashi, mechanically speaking. So either there's a notion of Uke Nagashi that I'm not aware of, that I'm not familiar with, or it's essentially applying the wrong name to the practice that's being demonstrated in terms of influence or whatnot. Moving on.
Kicking.
Yes.
Downstairs, I wish you were there.
That's a haiku.
How about in the eyes of the law? If you look like the
I
aggressor,
don't want to sound terrible because
well, you're above
I
the law.
used to be a police, but I don't care
No.
about the law.
You should care about the law. I mean, it's what keeps civil society going, for one thing. And even if you're talking about battlefield, at the very least, modern battlefield, I'm pretty sure that there's some legal implication to whatever you're doing. So, yeah, if you're in a position where you're going to have to basically, use force and violence on a regular basis, you really want to know the law and abide by it before, so to avoid to get into trouble. Moving on.
You will sever the brainstem. You will sever the brainstem. That's what happens. That's why when people, like for example, when you come to grab my leg, as you come here, I'll hit you here. By the time you're down here, look what's exposed.
Yeah.
It's your brainstem.
So I think the implication here is that you would basically sever the brainstem using a strike. If you've seen this short clip, you're going to notice that there is this strike down here that you're seeing also in the previous video. That's a technique in sumo. It's called sokubi otoshi. Is it dangerous? Certainly. There's been people suffering from concussion because it basically ended up being more of a strike, which is what Mr. Segal seems to imply here. But it is a legal technique in sumo. So to infer that somehow this could be lethal, or more specifically that it could be lethal due to severing the brainstem, seems a little bit unlikely to me. Moving on.
What is your method for power generation? Because I've heard so many different ways of generating power.
Practice,
Yeah, of course.
practice,
Yeah.
and meditation,
Oh, okay.
and Zen.
How does meditation and
Okay, then
Zen...
we're gonna have to.
Okay.
So he's not explaining a whole lot here about why meditation and Zen would actually help with power generation. It looks to me like Mr. Segal and Mr. Enkamp were basically talking past each other here. But it's still a point that's worth expanding upon a little bit. There's much to be said about how portions of some religious practices in Japan actually helped condition the body in some way, shape, or form. But to associate this with practical power generation that could be leveraged in a combative situation seems to me like a bit of a stretch. So unless Mr. Segal would be so kind as to expand a little bit on that idea, it's a little bit hard to know what to make of this, honestly. Moving on.
And they would never try to tarnish what they are. In America, it's different.
Yeah.
They don't care. Where I came from, if you did that, somebody will come and kill you the next day.
Yeah.
They'll come to your dojo or your house and say, it's on right now.
Yeah.
One of us is going to live and one of us is going to die.
Yeah.
Or one of us is going to be unconscious and maybe he'll live and maybe he won't. I don't care.
Yeah.
Again, there's some kernel of truth to that. There's been stories to that regard. But we need to remember that Mr. Segal was in Japan in the 70s. The 70s weren't like the wild West in Japan. It was by then already a rather peaceful society, mostly focused on, just building its economy. And yes, there were some people and there has been some events around that time period that were a little bit more extreme, but that was far from being the norm. And I think that's the implication that bothers me the most from what Mr. Segal is saying here, is that, somehow in Japan it's just like, a lawless land where anyone can go and, engage some other person into a life or death battle. It's silly. Japan is a perfectly civil society, and it has been for, quite some time now. All right, I'm going to stop here because there's also a part 2 to this, but honestly, the part 2 doesn't really include anything that I thought was really super exciting, relevant. There aren't also any really problematic statements that I remember from the second video, so maybe, if I watch it again, I'll do a part 2 to this video, but for now, we'll stop it here. Now, as you've seen today, there's a lot of kind of half-truth and statements that are rooted in truth but are kind of lacking context. And that's the problem with, dealing with people that have a certain amount of knowledge about Japan and the practice, but are kind of using it for their own device instead of trying to make sure to be accurate in what they're conveying, and to make sure that essentially, the culture and spirit of whatever Japanese cultural practice, namely here, modern martial arts or classical martial arts, that these things are conveyed the proper way. There's no denying that Mr. Segal has been in Japan. He speaks in Japanese in this video. It's a little bit hard to understand in my opinion, but it's still accurate Japanese as far as I could tell. And he's lived in Japan. He's spent a good amount of time. Unfortunately, it somehow doesn't stop him from basically kind of stepping over the line and making statements that are questionable or wrong, as far as I can tell. And that's the problem I have with this video. That's the reason why I tried to reach out to Mr. Enkamp and discuss this in private, because I thought he might actually want to put out something on his own to address some of those issues. But overall, the biggest issues that I have are about how the Japanese culture is represented, and the problem with the truth that are pretty clear to me when it comes down to some of the statements being made. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any comments, please feel free to put them down in the comments down below. As always, thank you for your time, and until next time.